As mentioned earlier, we wanted to talk about what are the conditions basically throughout the flyway. And when we made our selection process of who we were going to invite to this meeting, we wanted to try to have at least some representation of the flyway from Louisiana all the way back up to Canada. So Larry, we appreciate, again, you being here to talk about Louisiana because you are the waterfowl biologist for the state of Louisiana. And, you know, as a resident of Louisiana and as a longtime duck hunter, kind of think of Louisiana as duck paradise. But when you really sit down and start looking at the numbers of acreages of rice, land loss with marsh and that kind of stuff, but this meeting forced me to do a little bit of research. It's pretty disturbing to see what's out there, and it's kind of scary what's happening in Louisiana, what's happening in the coast right now.
Well, that may be one topic that no one in Louisiana needs educated on. We have been talking about coastal wetland loss in Louisiana for decades, over 50 years. We've currently lost a full 25% of our coastal landmass to erosion, subsidence, and other forces. We're currently, well, the long-term average is about losing a football field every 34 minutes, just to put it into a scale that people can recognize. And that loss continues. The rate has slowed, as you would expect it to slow. All the easy stuff is gone, kind of like your work. If it was easy, it'd have been done already. And so that rate has slowed, but we're continuing to lose coastal wetlands at a rate of about a football field every 100 minutes. So every hour and a half or so. Almost as important as the loss in acreage is the degradation occurring in the wetlands that continue to exist. And we know that that is having an influence on waterfowl habitat use and abundance for a couple of reasons. The first one is I fly the same 27 transects 4 times a year, estimating the number of waterfowl in the coastal zone of Louisiana. And even in my 15 years of flying those surveys, which has corresponded to Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Gustav, and other issues, there are lines where I can see the changes in the amount of wetland habitat and can go back and look at those data and see that we are seeing fewer ducks on those transect lines. Conversely, because that doesn't mean anything unless you've got the opposite occurring, there are areas on my survey where we're doing coastal wetland restoration, where we're pumping land up, where we're building marsh, and on those lines I can see, anecdotally, that there are more ducks counted on those lines than in the past. And so some of the work that I'm initiating is, now that we've got the technology, the same technology that allowed us to estimate these loss rates for coastal wetlands, I can look at that 400-meter transect, because I've got a man looking 200 meters out one side and I'm looking 200 meters out the other side. We can look at that transect and look at marsh loss and compare it to the historical trend of ducks on those transects. So this is work that's continuing. But not only in loss and degradation, but we have other things that are happening in the coastal zone. I don't think anyone here in Louisiana is unfamiliar with our invasive aquatic issues. I myself am losing my hunting lease to giant salvinia. We have areas of the coast that have been covered recently in water hyacinth and giant salvinia in areas that used to winter a lot of ducks, especially in our coastal forests of southeast Louisiana, where that habitat no longer exists. So we have lots of problems in coastal Louisiana, and those problems manifest themselves not only in a reduction of the capacity of coastal Louisiana to winter ducks, but also to produce seafood and all of the other ecological goods and services that come from what has been termed America's wetland. It's actually an international issue, loss of coastal wetlands.
I think you nailed it on the head in your first sentence, is that pretty much everyone's aware of that. I mean, coastal erosion in Louisiana is a big deal. It's common knowledge. So we appreciate your comments, and you nailed it. You know, between loss of land and invasive species, there's not a whole lot of opportunities for ducks out there. They've got a big challenge to find food. The submerged aquatics, that's the stuff that's being lost. So with that said, one aspect of Louisiana that most people probably don't know is the rice production in the state is on its way down. In fact, it's not on its way, it's there. We always think of ourselves as a big rice producing state, but when you really look at the numbers, rice has been trending down in acreage in Louisiana for years. And based on some of the numbers I looked at, we're actually at an all-time low in rice production since 1930. So what's your thoughts on the loss of rice field habitat?
Well, I obviously hadn't gone back as far as 1930, but since 1970, we've lost nearly half of our rice acreage. And again, just like with the coastal wetlands, it's not just the loss in acreage, and I'm sure Kaysen will educate us more about this later in the discussion, but a rice field today is not the same as a rice field in 1970, 1990, or even 2010. In all of the information that Mickey put together for our last Flyway meeting, he pulled some data about waste grain availability, the food available in rice fields, and it's declined from over 400 pounds per acre to about 75 pounds per acre. Well, when you consider that the give-up density for rice in a rice field is about 50 pounds per acre. In other words, once there's less than 50 pounds per acre in a rice field, it costs a duck more to forage there than it does to go find a different rice field that isn't fed out.
And when you talk about efficiencies, we're talking about modern day combines. Basically, they're not losing any grain anymore. They're not throwing waste grain out the back of the combine.
That's definitely one aspect of it. And in fact, that hit us in the face a few years ago, even in northeast Louisiana, where we calculate duck energy day deficits or surpluses, sort of a theoretical guess as to how much resource is out there on the landscape and how many ducks it can support. And 5 or 6 years ago, we recalculated based on increased harvest efficiency in rice fields, and we went from a duck energy day surplus in northeast Louisiana to a duck energy deficit. And the only thing that changed was the amount of waste grain left. But there's something equally important, I think, and that is that rice is grown very differently now, with clear field varieties and intensive herbicide after the planting. There is nothing else in a rice field. In the past, there were millets, there were smartweeds, there were other plants growing out there on the levees and in the rice field itself. In fact, my first job back in 1985 was quantifying the amount of food available in rice fields in the Central Valley of California. And one of my big jobs was quantifying all of the non-rice seeds that we were vacuuming up from those randomly selected plots in the rice field. That does not exist anymore. There's nothing growing out there but rice, and the rice that's being harvested is being harvested far more efficiently. So rice fields are not the source of food resources that they were in the past.
So for our viewers, let me throw out a couple numbers to put this in perspective. And we went back and did some research on the FSA and the crop reported acres. In 1932, it looks like Louisiana planted a total of 465,000 acres of rice. Fast forward to 2018, we dropped to 433,000. So we're at an all-time low in rice production in the state of Louisiana. Also, to add to that, in 1932, there was zero rice in North Louisiana. Today, we're looking at around 100+ thousand acres are in North Louisiana. So when you look at South Louisiana today, we're only looking at about 350,000 acres of rice that's being planted now. So when you look at that drastic decrease in rice, it kind of raises a red flag. But it even gets worse when you start thinking about crawfish, because everybody, when you start thinking Louisiana, you think about crawfish balls. Well, crawfish has really gotten to be a popular commodity here in Louisiana, and it's been a way for rice farmers to supplement their income. And so that's a whole nother subject, that when we add crawfish to rice, which, to explain how the crawfish business works, typically crawfish are grown in a rice field that's already been harvested. And the crawfish feed on the stubble from the rice. And so that process keeps the rice field flooded for over a year. But what happens in a crawfish situation is the water's flooded really deep. And typically crawfish and ducks don't go together, because ducks just can't feed in a crawfish field. So when you start looking at the acreage of crawfish with the popularity that's going, you've got some numbers on crawfish that are pretty outstanding where we're going with crawfish. And when you factor that into what little bit of rice is left, there's really not a whole lot of places for a duck to land with ideal habitat in the rice field.
Well, and it's happened very quickly. You know, you took rice numbers back to the 30s. In 1970, we only had 3,000 acres of crawfish farms here in Louisiana, and now we have 227,000 acres of crawfish. And crawfish ponds, again, I go back to some of my aerial survey experience, because I get to see a lot of the state every time that I fly these surveys. And when I see crawfish tracks or crawfish traps in a field, I sit back and take a deep breath, because I know I'm not going to have many ducks to count. And so with the big increase in crawfish farms and all of the activity, not only are they flooded deeper than optimal for waterfowl foraging, but starting in November, there is almost constant activity in those fields, working those fields, harvesting the crawfish. And those crawfish farmers are dead set against birds of any kind using those fields. Between the flags and the cannons. And now these days, boy, if you ever drive south of Kaplan, hang west, you will see some of the most amazing laser light shows you have ever seen in crawfish farms, trying to keep birds out of there. It's a pretty difficult situation.
And the purpose of that is for a crawfish farm to succeed, they've got to maintain the integrity of the stubble for the crawfish to feed. So it's very important that they don't have any waterfowl, because a flight of geese can come in and wipe your stubble out overnight, and you're out of business in crawfish. So it's very important to a crawfish farmer that they harass these ducks and keep them on the move. So when you figure in the acreage you just spouted off, when there's only 300-some thousand acres of rice planted, we've got 200-some thousand acres of crawfish coming in behind that in the rice stubble. It's really disturbing when you sit down and look at the numbers for a duck coming to Louisiana. And then if you look at the rice fields that are not crawfish, you know every one of them's got a gun in it. That's a high-dollar duck lease, so they're being shot at there. So it's really a tough time for a duck coming to Louisiana.
Well, and it's important for hunters and of course all of us to understand that one of the reasons that Southwest Louisiana is so important to waterfowl and so important to waterfowl hunters is the juxtaposition of the coastal wetlands to the rice resource. It's the same in Arkansas with the forested wetlands in northeast Louisiana. In many places, it's the mixedness of these important habitat types that are important to keeping a wide variety of species and a large abundance of waterfowl taken care of over time. And in Louisiana, especially in the coastal zone, we're simply losing capacity to do that.
Was there any way, you talked about the loss of coastal wetlands and you talked about pumping up ground and trying to reclaim that? How's that process work? How does it go? What's the long-term prognosis on being able to rebuild some of our coastal wetlands?
You said the critical word in some. Some. When I was working for DNR, we estimated that we were addressing about 22% of our coastal wetland loss. Our coastal master plans from 2012 and 2017 have actually accepted that we are not going to be able to rebuild all of the coast. We're going to have something different than we've had. In fact, the Coastal Master Plan of 2012 wrote off the most important public hunting areas in Louisiana at the mouth of the river as unsustainable. That because of the subsidence rate, because of the reduction in sediment coming down the Mississippi River from a lot of the locks and dams in the river, that it was impossible to maintain that habitat. Probably they're right. We saw what happened after Katrina and Gustav and the issues that can happen down there. But we've been fighting constantly to keep that process working. Whenever we cut a crevasse in the levees, that land builds and ducks target it immediately. And so we've seen that we can take active management to improve the situation. But what we're fighting against is so large, and it's just something we are never going to be able to get completely on top of. And one comment I'd like to make as we get started here, because we're talking to hunters. I have a job because of hunters. I serve the hunters of the state of Louisiana. And one of our biggest issues, and I'm going to go back to Mickey Heitmeyer's mentor, as Mickey has been mine. One time at a meeting, he was addressing some of this frustration by saying, we have, and I quote, a fetish for stability. We want everything to be the same. We killed 2 million ducks last year. We want to kill 2 million ducks this year. And the fact is that is not the world. And it is especially not the waterfowl world. One of the things that Mickey has done over his career is focused on those dynamics. Dave lives in one of the most dynamic and endangered habitats that we have. It changes constantly, and we need to get past the frustration. For example, this hunting season, the worst ever. No, it wasn't. You've got to go back to 2001 through 2003 in Louisiana, where we were so angry that the Senate put together a waterfowl research committee to figure out what was wrong with duck hunting in Louisiana. And that committee didn't accomplish anything because the duck hunting improved, because it is dynamic. And the way Mickey led us into this conversation about long-term changes and annual changes makes it extremely complicated. And hunters and biologists and the general public have to come to grips with the fact that this is a highly dynamic resource that depends on a highly dynamic habitat. And these conversations started in 1921, and they're going to continue long past us being on this planet.
And as we tie in all the conditions up the flyway, all of this stuff is driven economically. You can't blame a farmer for doing what he's doing. He's got to make a living. And so all of these things that are changing are evolving, and they're driven by economics that are totally non-waterfowl related. So as we move up the flyway, let's just do a little quick summary of Louisiana, and I think all this is going to tie in when we have all of our speakers say what they're going to say. Is basically Louisiana is still losing a football field every 100 minutes of land. We're at an all-time low production in rice, and we're at an all-time high production of crawfish, which is really not compatible with waterfowl habitat.